The Virginia sun hung heavy over the sprawling plantation, its oppressive heat hiding shadows that moved in ways the eye could barely follow. No one knew his name, or even where he had come from, but the moment he appeared among the fields and grand halls, an uneasy hush fell over both masters and servants alike. There was something about the way he walked, calm yet deliberate, as if he measured the very pulse of the house before he stepped. Whispers followed him like a dark echo, tales of cunning intelligence, of a mind sharper than any overseer's whip, of eyes that seemed to see secrets no one dared speak aloud. At first, it was subtle, stolen glances, the quiet tilt of a head, a hidden smile exchanged in the corner of a room. But soon the plantation itself began to tremble under a truth unspoken, a series of scandals that would leave every family forever marked. He moved among them unnoticed, yet always in control, a shadow bending the desires and fears of those around him. And then the first child was born, a child whose features betrayed a secret so forbidden it could destroy everything. But he was already gone, vanished from the eyes of justice, leaving behind nothing but questions, whispers, and the creeping certainty that this was no ordinary man. Some said he could charm the impossible, evade punishment where others would perish, and bend the very moral order of the plantation to his will. By the time the first whispers of 37 children circulated in the candlelit halls, fear had become an almost tangible presence, a living thing lurking behind every shuttered window and closed door, reminding everyone that in Virginia's darkest corners, some secrets were meant to remain unpunished. Forever, the young slave arrived at the Virginia plantation under the cover of a humid, gray dawn. His presence barely noticed at first, as if the morning mist itself were conspiring to conceal him. He was not the kind of man who drew attention through brute strength or flashy display. His power was quieter, subtler, woven into the very way he carried himself. From the moment his boots touched the dirt paths that wound between the grandiose mansion and the sprawling fields, there was an air of unease, a silent tension that seemed to ripple through the plantation as if the land itself recognized something dangerous, something extraordinary, about him. His skin was a deep, rich hue that seemed to shimmer faintly in the early light, but it was the eyes that unsettled the observers most. Dark, intelligent, and piercing, they scanned the world with a calculated precision, missing nothing, catching every minute detail, storing it away as if the entire estate were merely a chessboard and he the master strategist. The first encounters with the other slaves were cautious. Some looked upon him with suspicion, wary of the quiet confidence that seemed almost unnatural in one of his position, while others were drawn to the subtle charisma that radiated from him without effort. He spoke sparingly, never revealing more than necessary, letting silence do the work of intimidation. Even the overseers, men who had ruled these fields with whips and threats for decades, found themselves unsettled by his calm gaze, a gaze that did not submit or shrink. There was an intelligence behind it, a quiet calculation that suggested he understood the hierarchy, the fears, and the weaknesses of every person he met. In the mansion itself, servants whispered about the way he moved through the corridors, observing the family, noticing details that no one else seemed to catch, and yet never speaking a word that might betray his thoughts. The plantation master, a man accustomed to controlling everything within his domain, felt an unspoken challenge in the air whenever the young slave was near. It was not overt defiance, but a subtle, almost imperceptible assertion of autonomy, a reminder that some power could not be bought or commanded. There were moments when the young man would pause in the sunlight filtering through the tall windows, and the master would feel a chill, as though the room itself acknowledged the presence of someone beyond ordinary control. Even before any scandal or whispered rumor, the plantation itself seemed to shift slightly, the balance of authority trembling in the quiet aftermath of his arrival. His mind, already sharp, began mapping the estate, learning the routines, the weaknesses, the hidden pathways and secret spaces where conversations could be overheard or diverted. He arrived with nothing but his wits and an uncanny sense of perception, yet it was immediately clear that this was not a slave who would simply endure the confines of bondage. He was a force that would bend the plantation to his unseen will, altering the course of lives in ways no one yet understood, and sowing the seeds of a darkness that would linger long after his first footsteps faded from the gravel paths. The plantation master first noticed him on a late afternoon, when the sun hung low and gold in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. It was not a moment of confrontation or rebellion. There was no overt act that demanded attention. Instead, it was the subtle command in the young slave's presence, the way he moved with a quiet confidence that suggested he understood more than anyone around him, that made the master pause and study him more closely than he ever had a slave before. He watched as the young man spoke with the other workers, not raising his voice or demanding respect, yet somehow inspiring it. There was a magnetic quality to his intelligence, an almost invisible thread of influence that bent those around him to his will without force or threat. The master had seen many slaves over the years, some clever, some strong, some cunning, but none had ever radiated a sense of comprehension so complete, so precise, that it seemed as though the young man could anticipate desires, fears, and thoughts before they were even formed. It was during one of these quiet observations that the master realized the danger, or perhaps the opportunity, this slave represented. The young man had noticed a flaw in a ledger, a small miscalculation that would have been overlooked by anyone else, and casually corrected it while offering a suggestion in a tone so respectful it was impossible to refuse. The master felt a mixture of irritation and admiration. Irritation because it implied a competence beyond the status of the enslaved, and admiration because there was no arrogance in the act, only precision, clarity, and an unsettling sense of control. Even the overseers, who prided themselves on enforcing discipline and obedience, seemed to falter under the young man's unspoken scrutiny. Their usual harsh commands felt almost unnecessary in his presence, as if the fields themselves were aware that authority here was more fragile than they had ever admitted. The master's curiosity turned into cautious obsession. He began noting every interaction, every movement, every exchange of glances. He found himself both captivated and unnerved by the young man's ability to navigate the complex web of the household, slipping through social hierarchies with ease, touching lives and thoughts in ways that left no trace, yet shifted the course of events imperceptibly. Each day, the slave's reputation grew, even silently, among those who worked the land and those who managed the house, and the master began to realize that intelligence could be as potent as brute force. There was a spark of fear buried deep in admiration, a recognition that this was no ordinary human being under his command. The plantation's delicate balance of power trembled imperceptibly, and the master, for the first time in decades, felt the chill of uncertainty, knowing that beneath the polite submission and apparent obedience lay a mind far beyond his comprehension, a mind that might one day alter the course of his entire household and expose vulnerabilities he had never before considered. The young slave began to move through the household with a careful, deliberate strategy that few could detect. At first, it was only brief glances, lingering just a moment too long in the corners of rooms where the women of the family passed, or subtle gestures that seemed innocent to anyone else but carried an unmistakable undertone. He learned quickly how to navigate the delicate boundaries imposed by a society that would never accept his desires openly, studying the patterns of those around him, observing their routines, noting their private spaces and hidden habits. There was a patience to him, a long game he understood instinctively, and it became clear that he had no intention of rushing what others might see as forbidden or dangerous. Instead, he allowed opportunities to unfold as if by chance, positioning himself in moments of solitude where words could be exchanged softly, gestures interpreted silently, and trust built in the shadow of suspicion. It was not seduction in the crude sense. There was no brash audacity, no overt aggression. His influence was subtle, intellectual, and almost imperceptible, threading itself into the consciousness of those he sought to engage. He spoke sparingly, choosing his words with precision, appealing to hidden fears, desires, and curiosities, making each interaction feel uniquely tailored. The women of the household, bound by rigid rules and constant surveillance, could not articulate why they felt drawn to him, yet they did, sensing a power that existed outside the conventional hierarchy. He became an invisible force, present but untouchable, commanding attention without demanding it, weaving himself into their private moments, the stolen conversations in corridors and gardens, the exchanged glances over candlelight and dinner tables. His movements were calculated to avoid detection. He knew when to retreat, when to linger, when to offer a word of comfort, a suggestion, or a simple smile that lingered far longer than propriety would allow. Slowly, he mapped the emotional terrain of the household, learning who could be swayed, who could be silenced, and who would unwittingly become a tool in his growing influence. Each small act of engagement, seemingly innocent on the surface, carried with it the weight of manipulation, an invisible shaping of loyalty, curiosity, and desire. The other slaves watched, some with awe, some with suspicion, but none could understand the depth of the calculations being made. In these quiet, almost imperceptible interactions, the young slave began to build a network of influence that would ultimately allow him to manipulate events far beyond his station. Each secret meeting, each whispered word, each small concession of trust became a brick in the foundation of something far larger, something that could unsettle the carefully constructed order of the plantation without a single overt act of defiance. He moved among them unseen, yet fully present, a shadow threading through their lives, bending human desire to his will, and planting the seeds of scandal that would ripple through the house in ways no one could yet imagine, preparing for a future where the rules of power, race, and propriety would bend silently, invisibly, around him. Rumors began to spread through the plantation like wildfire, whispered in hushed tones among the servants who worked the kitchens, tended the fields, and carried messages through the mansion's long hallways. At first, the murmurs were vague, almost innocuous, a glance that lingered too long, a conversation that seemed to vanish when someone approached, but as days turned to weeks, the unease grew palpable. Servants exchanged nervous glances, speaking in half-formed sentences that trailed off as soon as the young slave appeared nearby. There was something about him, they said, something that did not belong to the world in which they lived, a subtle force that seemed to bend the actions of those around him, unseen yet undeniable. Some whispered of his intelligence, sharp as any overseer's, yet tempered by a cunning that none of the masters could suspect. Others spoke of moments glimpsed from a distance, a private look shared between him and a member of the household, the quiet way a young woman's eyes seemed to follow him even when she thought no one noticed. The stories multiplied in the shadows, growing more elaborate with each retelling, a blend of truth, fear, and imagination that began to form a web around his presence. Even the plantation's more seasoned slaves, who had endured decades of cruelty and manipulation, found themselves unsettled by these rumors. They had seen many things over the years, rebellions crushed before they began, punishments doled with unflinching cruelty, but this was different. There was a subtle power at play, one that could not be measured by strength, position, or even cunning alone. Some began to speculate, quietly, about what the young slave might be capable of, exchanging stories in the privacy of the barn, the kitchen, or the servant quarters. Fear crept in, unspoken but heavy, as they realized that the line between what was seen and what was suspected could be manipulated, and perhaps even controlled, by a single mind. The plantation master, too, began to notice a shift, though he could not yet name it. Conversations faltered when the young man entered a room, laughter ceased abruptly, and subtle glances hinted at unspoken secrets. The whispers that reached his ears were carefully filtered, yet their implications gnawed at him. It was not simply mischief or malice, there was intent, a deliberate shaping of perception that he could sense but not yet trace. Even the most mundane interactions seemed to carry hidden meanings, as if the household itself were being rewritten in quiet, invisible strokes. What frightened everyone most was the uncertainty. No one could predict his next move, no one could be certain of his intentions, and yet, somehow, the young slave remained untouchable, his presence growing more influential with each passing day. Fear and fascination intertwined, creating a tension that threaded through every corner of the plantation. As the whispers multiplied and the shadows lengthened, it became clear that the household's orderly facade was beginning to crack, and that the young slave's subtle manipulations were only the beginning of a chain of events that would leave no one unmarked, no secret safe, and no life untouched by the quiet storm he was conjuring in the darkness of their own home. The first child arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, into a world unprepared for the revelation it carried. There was no announcement, no fanfare, just the hushed whispers of servants exchanging glances that said more than words ever could. The child's features, delicate yet unmistakable, bore an uncanny resemblance to the young slave, a truth that could not be denied by anyone who looked closely, yet somehow remained unspoken. In the rigidly controlled environment of the plantation, where every action was scrutinized and every relationship monitored, the child became a living secret, a presence that carried the weight of forbidden knowledge. For the women of the household, it was a mixture of terror and fascination, a quiet acknowledgement that their lives had been touched by someone whose power exceeded the bounds of social structure and law. The child was not simply a being, he or she was a symbol of defiance, of possibility, and of a future shaped by invisible hands. The young slave, who had orchestrated the encounter with patience and precision, treated the child with a calm that belied the storm brewing around them. He understood that the child's existence was dangerous not just to himself, but to anyone who had unknowingly been swept into the web he was weaving. He took care to remain unseen in ways that ensured protection, watching from the edges of rooms, guiding without touching, manipulating circumstances so that no accusation could ever gain traction. Every movement was calculated, every expression measured to avoid suspicion. The household continued its routine, oblivious to the underlying truth, yet every servant and family member carried a subtle, growing tension in the pit of their stomachs, sensing a presence that could not be named. The child's birth changed the atmosphere of the plantation in ways no one fully understood. Laughter in the hallways became quieter, conversations held in the open were replaced by private murmurs, and the eyes of both slaves and masters flickered with unease whenever the child appeared. In the privacy of servants' quarters, speculation ran rampant, blending awe with fear, yet no one dared to confront the reality directly. The child, innocent and unknowing, became a living testament to a truth that would ripple outward, a quiet rebellion that challenged authority and control without a single open act of defiance. The master of the plantation, who had long prided himself on overseeing every detail, felt a subtle shift in the balance of power but could not place it. Something unseen had changed. Even as he conducted his affairs with the same rigid order as always, there was a tension he could not dispel, a feeling that an invisible hand had reached into his household and altered the rules of loyalty, obedience, and influence. The child, without understanding its own significance, became the spark around which fear, fascination, and unspoken admiration began to swirl, marking the beginning of a story that would unravel conventions, defy punishment, and etch the young slave's cunning into the memory of everyone who dwelled within the plantation's walls. The young slave's survival and growing influence depended not just on charm or intellect, but on a careful mastery of manipulation, and he wielded it with the precision of a master strategist. From the moment the first child arrived, he recognized that the fragile threads of secrecy and control could unravel with a single misstep, and he devoted himself to ensuring that nothing, even the smallest detail, could be used against him. Every interaction, every glance, every word spoken in his presence was a calculated move, a way to gain insight into desires, fears, and weaknesses of both the white household and the enslaved community around him. He became a silent architect of perception, shaping reality without ever appearing to interfere, allowing his influence to grow unnoticed while keeping suspicion carefully at bay. Even the most vigilant overseers and the keenest-eyed family members could not trace the invisible lines of his subtle power, for he had learned to operate within the shadows of their attention, always one step ahead of discovery. His knowledge of the plantation and its inhabitants became a weapon, and he used it with extraordinary cunning. He observed everything, the timing of doors closing, the hidden corners where conversations lingered, the unguarded words spoken in moments of fatigue or frustration, and he stored it all, cataloging each piece of information for future use. When a situation arose that threatened exposure, he acted with quiet decisiveness, redirecting suspicion, altering perception, and leaving no evidence behind. A misplaced object here, a casually whispered suggestion there, a calculated act of charm or empathy, each move was carefully designed to deflect scrutiny, to weave a protective web that no one could penetrate. His manipulation was never cruel for its own sake, it was precise, purposeful, and often invisible to those who might otherwise suspect. Even within the enslaved community, he demonstrated a rare talent for persuasion. Other slaves, naturally wary of the consequences of interference, became unwitting allies, subtly drawn into his sphere without realizing the role they played in protecting his secrets. He read their motivations as effortlessly as one reads a page, understanding which hearts could be swayed, which fears could be stoked, and which loyalty could be earned through simple gestures of recognition or support. By shaping both fear and trust, he created a network of influence that stretched across the plantation, a lattice of protection that shielded him even from the eyes of the master himself. Through this meticulous manipulation, he gained a kind of immunity. No accusation could stick, no suspicion could solidify into proof, for he had ensured that every thread of danger could be severed before it reached critical mass. The plantation itself became his chessboard, each person a carefully positioned piece, and every outcome subject to his subtle direction. The young slave's genius lay not in open defiance, but in the ability to orchestrate control where none seemed possible, to secure power invisibly, and to make survival, and eventual dominance, appear effortless, a testament to the quiet, lethal intelligence that ensured his freedom where others might have fallen. The plantation master's suspicion grew slowly at first, like a shadow stretching across the sunlit fields, subtle and almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore once fully recognized. It was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual accumulation of small, unsettling anomalies, a glance that lingered too long, a suggestion that seemed harmless but carried a weight of influence, or a hushed conversation that ended the moment he entered a room. The master had overseen this estate for decades, and he prided himself on knowing every detail, every worker, every whispered secret, yet the young slave defied all expectation. There was an uncanny intelligence in him, a subtlety that allowed him to move within the household, shaping events, and bending the will of those around him without ever breaking the rigid structure of obedience that the plantation demanded. The master began to notice patterns that did not belong, threads of influence woven with invisible hands, and he could not help but feel a flicker of unease he had not known in years of command. His observations became increasingly deliberate. He watched the slave from a distance, noting how he interacted with the women of the house, how other servants seemed to respond almost instinctively to his suggestions, and how events seemed to bend subtly around him. The young man never raised his voice, never issued commands, and yet the flow of the household shifted in response to him. Objects misplaced at precise moments, miscommunications orchestrated with delicate finesse, and the quiet realignment of loyalties created a subtle chaos that the master could feel but not immediately define. There was intelligence here, yes, but also a kind of cunning that suggested awareness far beyond the social bounds imposed upon him. The more the master observed, the more he realized that this was no ordinary slave. With growing suspicion came a gnawing unease. The master could sense the risk, a latent threat that was both invisible and undeniable, yet he found no concrete evidence to justify action. The young slave's genius lay precisely in this ability to evade scrutiny, to act in ways that left no trace, and to manipulate perception so subtly that the line between truth and imagination blurred. Every failed attempt to catch him in a misstep deepened the master's discomfort, creating a tension that seeped into every corner of the household. Even his closest advisors and overseers began to sense it, the quiet influence of a mind operating beyond control, bending events with precision that could not be matched. The master wrestled with a dangerous mixture of admiration and fear. He recognized talent and cunning where few would dare to look, yet he also understood the potential for disaster if this talent were directed against him or the order of the plantation itself. The young slave remained outwardly obedient, polite, and unassuming, but every action, every measured smile, hinted at a power that could destabilize the carefully maintained hierarchy. The tension grew with every passing day, a silent war of observation and countermeasure, with the master questioning not only the limits of his authority but the very rules that bound the world he thought he controlled. The house, once orderly and predictable, now felt alive with uncertainty, a space where influence had shifted imperceptibly into the hands of one who, by law and status, should have been powerless. The young slave's genius was not limited to subtle charm or quiet intelligence. He understood the power of alliances, even among those who were seemingly powerless. In the dimly lit corners of the plantation, where gossip and observation flowed freely among the other slaves, he began forming connections that no one outside his circle could perceive. It was not a matter of loyalty or friendship in the conventional sense, for he knew that trust was a currency more valuable than gold, and yet far more fragile. Instead, he built a network of complicity, a series of unspoken agreements and silent understandings that allowed him to move freely while keeping his secrets safe. These alliances were woven with care, touching those whose influence was subtle yet significant, those who could pass along information, misdirect inquiries, or simply observe without raising suspicion. Each person became a quiet instrument in a larger symphony, a participant in a web of protection that stretched further than any overseer could imagine. He did not coerce or threaten, he persuaded. He knew the hopes, fears, and private frustrations of those around him and used them as leverage, carefully nudging behaviors without forcing obedience. In the servant quarters, in the shadows of the barn, and even in the muted spaces behind the mansion, whispers traveled along invisible lines, passing through the network he had cultivated. Each message, each diversion, each small act of compliance reinforced the structure he had built, a lattice of influence designed to conceal, protect, and manipulate. Those within the network often did not realize the full extent of their role, thinking themselves merely helpful, sympathetic, or observant, unaware that their actions were part of a greater plan orchestrated with patience and precision. The plantation master remained oblivious, focusing on the apparent order of daily life while subtle disruptions and invisible currents altered the flow of his household. Objects went missing, conversations were diverted, and small mistakes occurred that seemed trivial but consistently worked in the young slave's favor. The network allowed him to anticipate threats before they reached him, to redirect attention away from dangerous inquiries, and to maintain control in ways that appeared entirely natural. Even the overseers, proud and vigilant as they were, could not detect the careful orchestration taking place beneath their noses. As time passed, the young slave's network became more than a shield, it became a conduit of power. He could observe, influence, and maneuver with a freedom no ordinary slave could possess. Each member of the network carried a piece of his strategy, acting unknowingly to extend his reach, manipulate perception, and secure his survival. Through these hidden alliances, he shaped the dynamics of the plantation with near-invisible hands, bending the behavior of both masters and servants alike. His influence spread quietly, methodically, until the estate itself seemed to operate according to his unseen design, a testament to his cunning, foresight, and understanding of human nature that allowed him to thrive where others would falter, and to remain untouchable even in a world built to deny him agency. Over the years, a pattern began to emerge that few could articulate, but all who observed the young slave sensed its presence. He fathered children, many children, children whose features carried the unmistakable mark of his own, a truth that would have ruined him utterly had anyone dared to speak it aloud. Yet despite the enormity of what he had done, no accusation ever materialized, no evidence was found, and no punishment ever touched him. Each child became a silent testament to his cunning, a living proof of a secret so dangerous it could have toppled households and shattered social norms, yet he ensured that their existence remained shrouded in discretion. The children were scattered, born into different wings of the plantation, each carefully positioned so that no single observer could piece together the full story. The careful orchestration of timing, space, and influence allowed him to continue his work undisturbed, a quiet defiance hidden beneath the veneer of obedience. As the years passed, the young slave honed his methods, learning from every misstep, every near discovery, every subtle reaction from those around him. He studied the household's rhythms, the master's moods, the curiosities and insecurities of the women he involved, and adjusted his actions accordingly. Each relationship was a calculated endeavor, each child a strategic move that further cemented his influence while maintaining the facade of invisibility. Even when whispers began to circulate among servants or in the shadowed corners of the estate, he had already anticipated them, planting diversions and shaping perception in ways that allowed the truth to remain unattainable. He understood human nature with an almost supernatural clarity, predicting reactions, fears, and loyalties before they could solidify into a threat. Despite the enormity of his actions, he moved with a careful precision that made exposure seem impossible. Children were placed where they would be cared for yet remain discreet, connections disguised as coincidence or misattribution. He ensured that no patterns emerged obvious enough to alert the master or the overseers, and when suspicion arose, he diverted it subtly, redirecting attention toward innocuous matters. It was not brute force or luck that kept him safe, it was intelligence, patience, and a mastery of social engineering that allowed him to exploit weaknesses in human perception. By the time the count of his children reached dozens, the pattern itself seemed almost mythical to those who noticed hints of it. No one could prove anything, and yet the tension within the household grew as whispers of impossible events circulated in quiet spaces. The young slave had become more than a servant, he was an invisible architect of chaos and control, bending the lives of those around him with a careful hand. His life unfolded as a silent rebellion against the strictures imposed by the plantation, a testament to his intellect, cunning, and unyielding ability to remain untouchable even as the stakes climbed higher with each new life he brought into the world. The young slave understood the power of records, of documents, and the written word in a world governed by rigid hierarchies and meticulous bookkeeping. Every ledger, every registry, every note of births, deaths, and transfers could betray him if handled carelessly, and he knew that the smallest inconsistency might unravel the delicate web he had built over the years. With patience and precision, he learned to manipulate these details, to intervene in ways invisible to the casual observer, ensuring that no trace of his actions could be traced back to him. It was not merely concealment, it was mastery over perception, a calculated shaping of reality so that the plantation's official record told one story while the truth remained hidden in the spaces between entries. Each correction, each subtle adjustment, was performed with such discretion that even the most diligent overseers or the most attentive masters would never suspect interference. He observed how the household and its administrators treated records, noting their habits, their lapses, the times when oversight was lax, and the moments when attention was acute. From these observations, he devised a system of influence that allowed him to protect his secrets. A birth noted incorrectly here, a ledger overlooked there, or an entry subtly shifted in phrasing ensured that no one could connect the children he fathered to him. He became an invisible hand in the archival machinery of the plantation, moving facts without leaving fingerprints, erasing and rewriting history in ways that preserved the illusion of order while concealing his defiance. Even those closest to the details, the secretaries, the overseers who prided themselves on accuracy, remained unaware of the careful manipulations, seeing only what he allowed them to see, interpreting anomalies as mere errors rather than intentional acts. The ledger became both shield and weapon, a repository of knowledge that allowed him to anticipate danger before it arose. He could calculate where suspicion might emerge, which entries might be questioned, and preemptively redirect attention. By controlling the flow of information, he maintained authority over perception itself, creating an environment in which his actions could continue without interference. Others may have believed that authority rested with the master or the overseers, but in reality, the young slave had commandeered a subtler power, one that no whip, no law, and no hierarchy could challenge. Through this meticulous management, he maintained freedom in a world designed to deny it. The children he fathered, the relationships he navigated, and the influence he exerted were all safeguarded by his manipulation of records and the careful orchestration of information. No proof could ever be gathered, no accusation could ever be substantiated, and yet the legacy of his actions quietly shaped the household in profound ways. In this way, he ensured not only his survival but the silent expansion of his influence, bending reality to his will while the plantation remained blissfully unaware of the invisible architect who had rewritten its history, safeguarding secrets that could have destroyed him if left unchecked, and solidifying a power as enduring as it was unseen. The first real threat to the young slave's carefully constructed world came not from the master or the overseers, but from someone he had once considered an ally. A trusted confidant, a fellow slave who had aided him in subtle diversions and hidden maneuvers, began to falter under the weight of what they had witnessed. The confidant had seen too much, pieced together fragments of truth, and now harbored the dangerous thought of revealing what he had learned. The young slave, who had built his influence through patience, discretion, and calculated manipulation, suddenly faced a danger that could unravel decades of careful planning. Every strategy, every protective network he had painstakingly developed, depended on the silence of those around him, and now one voice threatened to shatter the delicate equilibrium he had maintained. He approached the threat with the same precision and intellect that had guided him through years of invisibility. There was no overt intimidation, no sudden confrontation. Instead, he employed subtle psychological tactics, tailored to the confidant's fears and desires. He reminded them, quietly, of the consequences of exposure, not just for himself, but for those they cared about, for their own position in the precarious social hierarchy of the plantation, and for the fragile web of relationships that bound the enslaved community together. The young slave understood that fear, carefully applied, could be as effective a weapon as loyalty, and he wielded it with subtlety, creating a mental landscape in which silence became the only rational choice. He also offered incentives, gestures that seemed casual yet carried immense weight. A small favor here, a discreet act of protection there, each carefully calculated to strengthen the confidant's dependence on him and to reinforce the idea that revealing the truth would bring far more harm than benefit. He manipulated perception with an almost surgical precision, guiding thoughts without ever appearing to interfere, until the confidant could no longer separate their own reasoning from the invisible influence of his design. Slowly, inexorably, the potential threat dissolved, transformed into yet another loyal participant in his invisible network. Even as he neutralized the immediate danger, the young slave remained vigilant, knowing that exposure could arise from unexpected quarters at any moment. He refined his strategies, adjusted his observations, and ensured that every member of his inner circle remained unknowingly aligned with his objectives. The incident served as a reminder of the fragility of secrecy and the constant necessity of foresight, yet it also highlighted the extraordinary skill with which he could control perception, loyalty, and fear. By turning a potential revelation into an extension of his influence, he demonstrated that the mastery of human psychology, rather than brute force, was the true foundation of his survival, and that even the most dangerous threats could be transformed into instruments of his enduring power. The young slave's ability to evade detection reached its pinnacle during a moment that could have spelled his ruin, a moment when suspicion sharpened like a blade poised above him. An overseer had begun piecing together fragments of unusual activity, misplaced items, whispered conversations, fleeting glances, that suggested the presence of something hidden, something deliberate. For the first time, the young man faced scrutiny that was neither distracted nor easily diverted, and he knew that a single misstep could unravel years of careful planning. Yet, true to his nature, he approached the threat not with panic, but with an intricate strategy born of patience, intelligence, and an uncanny understanding of human behavior. Every action he took was calculated to mislead, to redirect attention, and to create the illusion of innocence while simultaneously masking the truth of his presence and influence. He began with subtle distractions, orchestrating small incidents designed to occupy the overseer's attention elsewhere. A missing tool in the barn, a dispute among field hands, a miscommunication in the kitchen, each minor disruption acted as a smokescreen, drawing suspicion away from his true activities. These diversions were carefully timed and executed, seemingly spontaneous yet entirely orchestrated, ensuring that the overseer's gaze never lingered too long on him. Simultaneously, he manipulated perception through indirect influence, guiding conversations, planting doubts in the minds of others, and allowing his enemies to reach false conclusions while he remained outside the sphere of scrutiny. The brilliance of his method lay in its invisibility. He never confronted the threat directly, but bent circumstances around him with a subtle, almost imperceptible force. Even within the enslaved community, he leveraged loyalty, discretion, and fear to protect himself. Allies in his network unwittingly acted as buffers, offering explanations, diverting questions, or reinforcing narratives that kept the overseer at bay. Their actions, though seemingly autonomous, were guided by the invisible architecture of his influence. Each participant, without understanding the full scope of his plan, played a role in preserving his freedom. The plantation, with all its rigid hierarchies and watchful eyes, became a stage for a carefully choreographed performance in which every movement and misdirection had purpose. Through this meticulous orchestration, he ensured not only survival but dominance. The overseer, frustrated and confused, could perceive patterns yet could never assemble the full truth. Every close call reinforced the young slave's reputation for cunning, solidifying his presence as a force to be reckoned with, yet leaving him untouchable by law, punishment, or authority. His mastery over anticipation, deception, and human perception allowed him to escape scrutiny repeatedly, turning even the gravest threats into opportunities for control. Each near discovery became a test of his intellect and foresight, demonstrating that his freedom and influence were secured not through physical power, but through an unerring command of subtlety, strategy, and psychological precision that left him untouchable in a world designed to confine him. As the young slave's influence expanded, it became increasingly clear that his power extended far beyond simple survival. He had begun to shape the household itself, often without the knowledge of those who lived within it. The children he fathered, scattered and hidden, unknowingly carried fragments of his presence into every corner of the plantation, and through them, he exerted an influence both subtle and profound. He understood that the bonds of blood, even when unacknowledged, could serve as conduits for control, and he manipulated circumstances so that his offspring, whether aware or not, would reinforce his quiet authority. The women of the household, whose affections and attention he had long guided, remained unwitting participants in a network of power that extended invisibly through generations, each interaction carefully orchestrated to ensure compliance, trust, or diversion whenever it was necessary. Through this unseen influence, he was able to guide the flow of events in the mansion and the fields alike. Orders were carried out, conflicts subtly deflected, and rumors carefully shaped, all in ways that favored his continuing protection and freedom. He never imposed force openly, for that would have drawn scrutiny. Instead, he worked through human psychology, intuition, and the exploitation of desire and fear. The adults and older slaves, caught in the familiar patterns of obedience and loyalty, failed to recognize the threads of his design. They believed they were making choices independently, yet every decision they took could be traced, however indirectly, to his careful direction. Even the plantation master, who had prided himself on absolute control, remained unaware that the true architecture of influence within the estate had shifted beneath his nose. As more children were born, the young slave's unseen authority became ever more intricate. He mapped the potential outcomes of each interaction, anticipating rivalries, alliances, and misunderstandings that might arise naturally, and he positioned himself to exploit them. Every glance, every word, every carefully timed suggestion served to reinforce the web he had spun, a lattice of influence extending from the servants' quarters to the highest floors of the mansion. His presence, though invisible, was like a current beneath the surface of the plantation, shaping tides without ever breaking the stillness above. Even as decades passed, the young slave remained untouchable, his influence both enduring and mutable. Those who encountered the subtle effects of his manipulation often felt a sense of unease or confusion, a faint recognition that events were not unfolding entirely of their own accord. No one could name him as the source of this power, and yet it was undeniable in its reach. By embedding himself in the lives of both masters and servants, in the very fabric of the household and the plantation, he had created a system of control that transcended status, law, and social expectation, proving that true influence could exist entirely unseen, quietly bending the world to the will of one who refused to be constrained. The arrival of a new plantation master brought a wave of tension that the young slave had not yet faced, a disruption to the delicate balance he had cultivated over years of careful planning. The previous master had been cautious, predictable, and prone to distraction, allowing the young slave's subtle influence to remain undetected. This newcomer, however, was sharp-eyed, ambitious, and meticulous, someone who prided himself on uncovering even the smallest irregularities within his estate. From the moment he stepped onto the grounds, there was an air of scrutiny, a sense that every action, every word, and every glance might be measured and weighed. The young slave immediately recognized the threat in the new master's presence, understanding that his carefully constructed networks and invisible maneuvers would be tested as never before. Unlike the previous overseers or masters, the new master's attention to detail was relentless. He questioned discrepancies in records that had long gone unnoticed, scrutinized the placement of children and servants alike, and observed interactions between household members with an intensity that bordered on suspicion. The young slave could sense the heightened awareness, the tension in every room, and the subtle shifts in behavior among those around him who, like him, feared exposure. Yet he did not falter. Instead, he approached this new challenge with the same intelligence, foresight, and patience that had allowed him to survive in the past. He recognized that direct confrontation was impossible, any overt action would be scrutinized and potentially punished. Instead, he relied on subtlety, perception, and manipulation, weaving an intricate web of influence that would allow him to remain invisible even under intensified observation. He began by mapping the new master's habits, preferences, and vulnerabilities, studying his routines and tendencies with meticulous care. Every movement was observed, every reaction catalogued, every moment of attention noted. He used this knowledge to predict scrutiny before it could be applied, creating diversions and shaping perception so that the new master's gaze would never settle fully on him. Subtle interactions were orchestrated to reinforce an image of harmless obedience, while his network of confidants and allies, both free and enslaved, acted as buffers, shielding him from suspicion without ever realizing the full extent of their role. Through these careful manipulations, he maintained his invisibility, bending circumstances to his advantage without ever revealing the depth of his strategy. Even as the new master's presence introduced risk, the young slave demonstrated a rare ability to anticipate danger, preemptively counter threats, and continue exerting influence over the household. The plantation, once again, became a stage for his quiet orchestration, a place where control was measured not by authority or law, but by intelligence, foresight, and the mastery of human perception. Every glance, word, and gesture was calculated to maintain the delicate balance, ensuring that even under heightened scrutiny, his secrets and influence would remain untouchable. The young slave's mastery of manipulation reached new heights when he faced the subtle but relentless scrutiny of those who had begun to suspect the unnatural influence he wielded. He understood that to survive and thrive, mere cunning was not enough. He needed to shape perception itself, bending reality in ways so subtle that observers would doubt their own senses. He began employing psychological strategies that bordered on the uncanny, exploiting fear, desire, and doubt to deflect suspicion before it could solidify into accusation. Every gesture, every word, and every carefully timed pause was part of a larger choreography designed to mislead, distract, and ultimately control the minds of those around him without ever appearing to do so. He was no longer merely surviving, he was orchestrating the plantation like a living puzzle, each person a piece manipulated with precision. He studied those who might pose a threat, anticipating their thoughts and preempting their actions. If a master's curiosity threatened to uncover a secret, he offered subtle misdirections, planting seeds of doubt that made the observer question the reliability of their own judgment. If a confidant began to waver, he invoked fear through quiet reminders of consequences, not in the form of threats, but as suggestions that loyalty and silence were in everyone's best interest. He created layers of perception, each one carefully calculated to ensure that truth remained obscured while control remained firmly in his hands. No one could confront him directly, because even when attention turned toward him, the narrative had already been shaped, leading observers down paths of false certainty while leaving him untouched at the center of the storm. He also exploited human desire and curiosity, directing attention to trivial matters while the most important truths remained invisible. Small distractions, perfectly timed, ensured that suspicion never coalesced into evidence. Whispered rumors were carefully seeded and allowed to propagate, creating a network of confusion that worked to his advantage. Those who might have connected the dots found themselves ensnared in misdirection, questioning their own perceptions and failing to see the invisible architecture of his influence. Even as the risk of exposure increased, he transformed every potential threat into an opportunity, extending his reach and tightening the web of control he maintained over both the masters and the enslaved. Through these techniques, he demonstrated a chilling command over human behavior, turning fear, curiosity, and desire into instruments of his survival. He had become untouchable not by brute force, but through an almost supernatural understanding of psychology and social dynamics. His influence extended far beyond what anyone could observe, shaping outcomes, bending wills, and preserving his secrets with a precision that seemed preternatural. Every danger, every hint of suspicion, was transformed into a tool, and the plantation itself became a stage upon which he orchestrated events invisibly, bending the reality of those around him so thoroughly that no one could discern the true extent of his power or challenge it. The young slave's control over the plantation had reached a level that seemed almost preternatural, and yet even he understood that absolute mastery required constant vigilance. He recognized that influence alone was fragile without an infrastructure to reinforce it, and so he began to embed mechanisms of observation and subtle guidance throughout the household and fields. He trained his eyes and ears to catch minute shifts in behavior, the way a servant hesitated before speaking, the flicker of recognition in a child's gaze, the nervous glance of an overseer unaware of the invisible forces at work. Every nuance became a signal, every interaction a data point to be analyzed and incorporated into his ongoing strategy. In this way, he transformed the plantation itself into a living instrument of his influence, where even the smallest gestures and routines served a purpose in maintaining control. Through careful observation, he could anticipate disruptions before they occurred. A slight change in a schedule, a new overseer arriving, or a master's altered mood, all were accounted for in his mental map of the estate. He adapted his own behavior accordingly, positioning himself to exploit opportunities, mitigate risk, or redirect attention with a subtlety that no one could detect. His presence, though quiet and unassuming, was omnipresent in effect, reaching into spaces both public and private, influencing outcomes without ever revealing the hand behind them. The plantation's operations, from the rhythm of labor to the smallest details of domestic life, flowed in patterns he had carefully orchestrated, though to any observer it seemed natural, even mundane. He also deepened the network of allies and unwitting participants, carefully cultivating loyalty and dependence in ways that ensured his secrets remained secure. Each member of the household and field staff played a role, often unknowingly, in maintaining his safety and amplifying his influence. A servant might misplace an object at precisely the right moment, a child might deliver a message that obscured intent, or a casual conversation might be guided to produce confusion among those who might question him. The beauty of his system lay in its invisibility. Actions were untraceable, intentions undetectable, yet the results were always aligned with his overarching strategy. Even the plantation's most vigilant overseers and the master himself were unaware of the full extent of his control. They perceived anomalies, fleeting moments of confusion or misdirection, yet could never assemble them into a coherent picture. The young slave had become a master of anticipation and preemption, turning potential threats into tools and uncertainty into a shield. His ability to influence perception, behavior, and circumstance allowed him to navigate the most dangerous challenges while remaining untouchable. Through patient observation, strategic orchestration, and an unerring grasp of human psychology, he transformed the plantation into a stage upon which he ruled invisibly, ensuring that every outcome, no matter how complex, served the preservation of his freedom and the continuation of his unseen power. The young slave's influence reached a level where even the most mundane details of the plantation were infused with his subtle control, and yet he understood that true mastery required not only manipulation of perception but the careful shaping of emotion. He began to exploit the unspoken desires, fears, and insecurities of those around him, guiding thoughts and actions with a precision that made every interaction a tool for his survival and advancement. He observed the women of the household, noting how curiosity, boredom, and loneliness could be directed to serve his purpose, and how small gestures, a lingering glance, a word carefully chosen, could alter moods and behaviors in ways that reinforced his position. The household, unaware of the invisible currents moving within it, responded naturally to his influence, further solidifying his untouchable status. Even among the enslaved community, he used emotional insight to cultivate loyalty, manipulate compliance, and protect himself from exposure. He recognized who could be persuaded through subtle kindness, who could be guided by fear, and who might serve as a buffer against scrutiny. By understanding and exploiting these emotional dynamics, he extended his control far beyond what could be observed externally, creating a network of influence that encompassed both master and servant, powerful and powerless alike. Each relationship became a lever, each response a mechanism to guide events without revealing his hand. The young slave's mastery of human emotion allowed him to turn suspicion into confusion, curiosity into distraction, and loyalty into unwitting complicity, ensuring that his actions remained invisible even as they shaped reality around him. He also employed the element of unpredictability to maintain his edge. By occasionally allowing behavior that appeared impulsive or innocuous, he kept those around him uncertain, preventing patterns from forming that might reveal the true extent of his influence. The master, overseers, and household staff could sense the subtle manipulations, yet they could never trace them back to him. This careful balance of control and illusion allowed the young slave to operate with near-complete freedom within a world designed to suppress and punish, turning every potential vulnerability into an opportunity for reinforcement of his power. Through these methods, he created a dynamic in which emotion, perception, and action were all under his unseen direction. Every fear he anticipated, every desire he manipulated, and every instinct he subtly guided contributed to the reinforcement of his untouchable status. The plantation, once a rigid hierarchy of authority and subjugation, became a landscape he navigated effortlessly, bending the lives of those around him to his will while leaving no evidence of interference. In this way, he elevated survival into artistry, demonstrating that true control lay not in force or visibility, but in the quiet, meticulous mastery of human emotion, thought, and perception, securing his freedom and influence in ways no law or authority could ever challenge. The young slave's reputation, though largely invisible to the formal authorities of the plantation, began to take on a quiet, almost mythical presence among those who observed the subtle patterns of his influence. Stories circulated in whispers, often fragmented and exaggerated, of a figure who could manipulate circumstances with a glance, who seemed to anticipate every question before it was asked, and who maintained control over outcomes that others assumed were random or coincidental. Even those who had never interacted with him directly sensed an unseen hand guiding events, an invisible architect shaping the household, the fields, and the very rhythm of life on the plantation. These stories spread not as direct accusations, no one could pinpoint evidence, but as a shared recognition that something extraordinary was at work, something that defied conventional understanding. Among the enslaved, the young slave became both a figure of awe and caution. They spoke of him in hushed tones, noting how he could secure favors, avoid punishment, and remain untouchable despite actions that would have destroyed others. Some admired his intellect and cunning, while others feared the reach of his influence, recognizing that even the smallest misstep in their interactions with him could carry consequences they could not fully foresee. Yet no one dared to challenge him openly, for he had created a system in which loyalty, fear, and subtle manipulation were indistinguishable, leaving those around him uncertain where obedience ended and self-preservation began. Even those who might have sought to expose him found themselves ensnared in the invisible currents he had carefully directed, misled by their own assumptions and desires. The young slave's influence extended beyond individual interactions. It became a force that shaped the social and emotional landscape of the plantation itself. The master and overseers, unaware of the full scope of his control, often misattributed the outcomes of events to chance, divine providence, or the failures of others, never suspecting the deliberate orchestration behind them. Small incidents, carefully arranged diversions, and subtle interventions reinforced the perception of normalcy while masking the extraordinary precision of his manipulations. The invisible threads of power he had woven touched every aspect of life, from the management of resources to the shaping of human relationships, creating a lattice of influence that no one could fully penetrate. Over time, his reputation became a kind of quiet legend, a paradoxical mixture of fear, respect, and incredulity. People sensed the extraordinary reach of his mind and the precision of his actions, yet they could never confront or quantify it. He existed simultaneously as a servant and as a master of circumstance, a shadow figure whose power was defined not by visible authority but by the subtle control he exercised over perception, behavior, and consequence. In this way, the young slave transformed the plantation into a stage for his invisible dominion, ensuring that his secrets remained secure, his influence continued unabated, and his presence, though unseen, became a force impossible to ignore. As the years passed, the young slave's influence deepened to such a degree that even the most vigilant observers could not trace the extent of his control. The children he had fathered, now growing into adolescence, carried his subtle imprint in ways that were difficult to detect but impossible to ignore. Their presence, behavior, and even casual choices reflected the quiet shaping of his hand, extending his influence beyond his own lifetime and embedding it within the very fabric of the plantation. Every action, whether a glance shared between peers or a seemingly trivial decision, worked in concert with his unseen guidance, reinforcing the networks he had constructed and perpetuating a legacy of subtle domination. This indirect reach allowed him to manipulate outcomes not only in the immediate household but across the broader social and operational structure of the estate, ensuring that even as he aged, his influence remained absolute. He understood that the key to enduring power lay in invisibility, in ensuring that the mechanisms of control remained undetectable. Every interaction with the children, every carefully chosen lesson or reprimand, was calculated to mold their perceptions and behaviors in ways that served his strategic objectives. Through patience and subtle guidance, he taught them how to navigate the plantation's rigid hierarchies, how to read the intentions of those around them, and how to manipulate circumstance without attracting notice. They became both heirs to his secret and instruments of it, unwittingly extending his reach into spheres he could no longer touch directly. The plantation itself became a living reflection of his foresight, each corridor, field, and household interaction shaped in part by his meticulous planning and quiet direction. Even the master and overseers, despite their authority, remained blind to the full scope of his influence. They could sense shifts in behavior, notice outcomes that defied expectation, or glimpse patterns that seemed too precise to be accidental, yet they could never attribute these phenomena to the young slave. He had trained perception itself to mislead, using subtle diversions, strategic timing, and the manipulation of emotion to ensure that no evidence could ever solidify into proof. Every risk that arose, every scrutiny, every curiosity, was anticipated and neutralized before it could threaten his freedom or the secrecy of his actions. Through these methods, he created a system in which power flowed invisibly, sustained by human behavior, fear, loyalty, and instinct. His children, his network of confidants, and the very patterns of life on the plantation became extensions of his will. Even as his own presence aged and diminished, the structures he had built ensured that control remained firmly in his hands, untouchable and unchallenged. By embedding his influence in both the living and the social fabric of the estate, he guaranteed that the consequences of his intelligence and foresight would continue to shape the plantation long after any direct observation of him had ended, leaving a legacy as invisible as it was absolute. The culmination of the young slave's years of meticulous planning and invisible influence was a freedom that few could have imagined, a state of untouchability so complete it seemed almost supernatural. By the time he had fully secured his position, he had become an architect of circumstances, a silent manipulator of outcomes, and a master of perception, ensuring that every action he took was cloaked in invisibility. The plantation, with its rigid hierarchies, strict laws, and constant surveillance, operated according to patterns he had carefully orchestrated, yet to any observer, it appeared normal, predictable, even orderly. He moved through this world like a shadow, present yet unseen, shaping events, guiding behaviors, and protecting his secrets with a precision that rendered accusation impossible. The very fact that he had fathered dozens of children across the estate, a feat that would have destroyed anyone else, was rendered irrelevant by his intelligence, foresight, and ability to manipulate both people and circumstance. His freedom was not granted by law or luck, it was claimed through the careful orchestration of human behavior, the subtle exploitation of emotion and perception, and an almost preternatural understanding of cause and effect. He had learned to anticipate threats before they could materialize, to redirect suspicion before it could solidify, and to ensure that every potential danger was neutralized through misdirection, loyalty, or fear. Even the master, the overseers, and the most observant servants could never piece together the full truth, for every observable pattern had been intentionally shaped to protect him. In this way, he achieved a form of autonomy and safety that defied the oppressive structures around him, securing his existence and influence in a world designed to deny both. Beyond mere survival, he had created a legacy of power that extended into the lives of his children and the broader social fabric of the plantation. The network of influence he had built, both visible and invisible, ensured that his objectives continued to be realized long after any direct interaction. Those who might have questioned, investigated, or confronted him were subtly guided, manipulated, or distracted, rendering any attempt at exposure futile. Each child, each confidant, each manipulated perception acted as a living extension of his strategy, reinforcing the invincibility of his position. In the end, the young slave's story was not one of brute force, rebellion, or open defiance, but of intelligence, subtlety, and psychological mastery. He had transformed the rules of power itself, demonstrating that authority could be claimed not through visibility or overt action, but through invisible orchestration, manipulation of perception, and control of consequence. His freedom was absolute because it existed in a space beyond the reach of law, punishment, or suspicion. He had become untouchable, a master of circumstances, a shadow ruler whose influence endured invisibly, proving that true power is not measured by what is seen, but by what can be accomplished without ever being observed.